The morning air was still dark and cold when I pulled into my parents' driveway at 6:02 a.m., headlights sweeping across the porch. My suitcase was in the trunk, my passport zipped safely in my purse, and my heart was buzzing with that rare mix of exhaustion and excitement, the kind that comes after years of saving for something you've dreamed about since childhood. Paris, Venice, Prague, a one-week trip through Europe with my parents. I had paid for everything down to the last guided tour and dinner reservation, imagining the look on my mother's face when she saw the Eiffel Tower for the first time. I had even printed little itinerary books with our initials embossed on the covers. I honked softly once waiting. The porch light flicked on, the door opened, and then my heart froze. My brother Lucas stepped out first, dragging a sleek black suitcase behind him. Behind him came my mother Elaine, smiling like it was Christmas morning. "You're late, Violet," she called cheerfully. "Come on, we don't want to miss the flight." I blinked, the words catching in my throat. My mother's eyes sparkled with an excitement that felt wrong. "Oh, honey, we decided Lucas should come instead of you. He's been under so much stress lately, poor thing. He needs this trip." The breath left my lungs as if I'd been punched. Instead of me, I asked quietly, "Mom, I paid for this. I planned it. For us." She waved her hand, dismissing my words as though they were a minor inconvenience. "I know, sweetheart, and we're grateful. But you're always so busy with work. You'll have other chances to travel. Lucas really needs to get away, clear his mind." Lucas leaned against the doorframe, smirking, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "Thanks, sis. You're the best." His words felt like glass under my skin. My father, Richard, stepped out next, adjusting his jacket and avoiding my eyes. "We should probably get going," he murmured, his tone flat guilty. I looked from one face to another, waiting for someone to laugh, to say it was a joke. No one did. The only sound was the soft drag of suitcases rolling down the steps. I swallowed hard, forcing my voice to stay even. "You're serious," I said. "You're actually going to take him on the trip I paid for?" My mother smiled, that rehearsed maternal smile that used to comfort me when I was a child. "Don't make this difficult, Violet. You know how fragile your brother's been since he lost his job. You'll understand someday." Her tone carried the finality of a door closing. I stared at Lucas, at the lazy confidence in his eyes, and felt something inside me harden. For years, I had been their fixer, the reliable daughter who paid the bills, solved the crises, picked up every broken piece. And here they were, rewarding his failure and punishing my effort in the same breath. I opened the trunk, the click echoing in the still morning air. "Get in," I said quietly. The drive to the airport was suffocating. My mother chatted about outfits and shopping. My father cleared his throat every few minutes, and Lucas hummed along to the radio as though nothing were wrong. At one point, he leaned forward and said, "You're not mad, right, Vi? I mean, you travel all the time for work. Let me have this one." My fingers tightened around the steering wheel. I didn't answer. When we reached the departure zone, I helped unload their luggage with steady hands that betrayed none of the shaking beneath. My mother hugged me quickly. "Thank you for understanding, sweetheart. This means a lot to us and to Lucas." I forced a smile. "Sure, Mom." Lucas grinned, that same smug grin that had followed him through every bad decision of his life. "You're a saint, Vi." I stood there as they disappeared into the terminal, the glass doors closing behind them. For a long moment, I just stared at the reflection of my own face in the car window, calm, still unreadable. Inside, something shifted. It was the quiet, precise sound of a boundary snapping into place. By the time I started the car, I knew one thing with absolute certainty: they had taken my trip, but they would not enjoy it. Not on my dime. I had spent nearly 2 years planning that trip, working late nights at the travel tech company in Chicago, where I managed logistics for clients who could afford what I couldn't. Every bonus check, every overtime hour, every canceled weekend had gone into that savings account labeled Europe with Mom and Dad. It wasn't just a vacation. It was supposed to be my way of saying thank you. After years of being the dependable daughter, I wanted to give them something extraordinary. I remembered the first time the idea formed my mother flipping through an old travel magazine at the kitchen table, sighing wistfully. "Your father and I never got to see Europe," she'd said. One day, maybe. At the time, Lucas had just crashed his third car, and the family was once again bailing him out. I'd promised myself that someday I'd be the one to make that dream happen for them. I booked the flights, chose boutique hotels near the Seine and the canals of Venice, arranged for English-speaking guides, even reserved a dinner cruise in Prague. I could see it so clearly in my mind, the look of awe on my father's face as we stepped into the Louvre, the sound of my mother laughing on a gondola ride. For a long time, that vision carried me through everything, the loneliness, the resentment, the quiet exhaustion of being the family's safety net. But deep down, I'd always known where I stood. Lucas was the sun around which my parents orbited. No matter how many times he failed, no matter how recklessly he lived, their affection never wavered. When he lost his job at 34, my mother called it a rough patch. When he maxed out his credit cards, my father called it growing pains. And when I covered their late mortgage payments 3 years ago, they didn't even tell him it might hurt his pride, they said. I told myself it didn't matter that love didn't need to be equal, as long as it was sincere. But sincerity has limits, and mine was quietly eroding with every new excuse they made for him. I remembered Christmas 2 years earlier. Lucas showed up empty-handed, smelling of whiskey, and my parents laughed off his forgotten gifts as just his free spirit. Meanwhile, the sweater I'd knitted for my mother sat unopened in a corner. I'd learned to smile through it all, to carry the weight of the family without complaint. But that morning at the airport, the unspoken truth finally became visible. Love in our house had always been conditional. The conditions just never favored me. I thought back to one particular conversation with my mother after I'd been promoted to senior project manager. I'd called excited, ready to share the news. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," she'd said, distracted. "But your brother's having such a hard time finding his footing. Maybe you could help him get into your company." I'd laughed it off then, but now that memory stung like acid. All my achievements were stepping stones for Lucas, never milestones of my own. As the car hummed down the highway after I left the airport, those moments replayed in my mind like a film I'd watched too many times. The nights I'd lent him money I never saw again. The job references I'd written for him that led nowhere. The times I'd defended him to friends who called him spoiled. Each recollection folded into the next until the truth was unbearable in its simplicity. I wasn't their daughter. Not really. I was their insurance policy, their fallback plan, their safety net. And what happens when the net finally decides not to catch them anymore? I gripped the steering wheel tighter as the sun broke over the horizon, washing the sky in pale gold. Somewhere across the Atlantic, my parents were sipping champagne in first class, smiling at the son who'd never earned it. Meanwhile, the daughter who had paid for it all was driving home in silence, her chest burning with a calm fury she'd never felt before. It wasn't heartbreak anymore. It was awakening. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sun was fully up, flooding the neighborhood in soft morning light that felt almost mocking. I sat in the car for several minutes, hands still gripping the steering wheel, staring at the faint reflection of my own face in the windshield. It wasn't shock anymore. It was something colder, sharper, a kind of understanding that left no room for denial. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a one-time slight. It was the final confirmation of something I'd spent years trying not to see in my family. Love had always been a transaction, and I was the one who paid. I thought of all the times I'd brushed off the favoritism, convincing myself that being responsible was reward enough. The night before my high school graduation, when Lucas got drunk and wrecked his car, my parents missed half my ceremony because they were bailing him out of the police station. The college acceptance dinner that never happened because he'd lost another job. The family Christmas when he announced he was moving back home to get his life together, and my parents turned my old bedroom into his new workspace, boxing up my trophies and photos without even telling me. I'd told myself it didn't hurt, that it was just family dynamics, that I was being mature. But sitting there now, I realized how well I'd trained myself to normalize being invisible. Even success hadn't changed anything. When I'd bought my first condo, my mother had said, "Good for you, honey. Maybe Lucas can stay there a while, just until he saves up." When I declined, she'd called me selfish. When I covered my parents' medical bills after Dad's surgery, they'd thanked Lucas for being such a support through hard times. Somehow, I was always the background figure funding fixing but never seen. And now they had taken it one step further. They had taken the trip that was supposed to be a thank you for my years of quiet loyalty and handed it to the same brother who couldn't hold a job or keep a promise. A bitter laugh escaped me. It was all so predictable. I'd always assumed there would be a breaking point, but I never expected it to feel this calm. No screaming, no tears, just a simple, exhausted clarity. Maybe this was what people meant when they said peace comes after acceptance. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd built a career managing other people's travel plans, turning chaos into order for clients around the world. Yet I'd failed to navigate the simplest journey of all, getting my own family to see me. My phone buzzed with a text from Grace, my best friend. "How's the airport, Chaos? You in line yet?" I stared at it, thumb hovering. How could I even begin to explain that the trip I'd planned, saved for, and dreamed about was now being enjoyed by the same people who had erased me from their plans without a second thought? That I was the one left behind. Not because I'd done anything wrong, but because they'd decided I didn't matter enough to bring along. I didn't reply. Instead, I turned off my phone, climbed out of the car, and walked into my house. It smelled faintly of the lavender candle I'd burned the night before when everything still felt possible. Now it just smelled like betrayal. I sat on the edge of the couch, staring at the neatly stacked travel documents on the coffee table, the printed itineraries, the prepaid confirmations, the envelope of euros I'd withdrawn for pocket money. My name was on every line, every invoice, every booking confirmation. Yet I wasn't part of it. That, more than anything, made my chest tighten. They'd not only replaced me, they'd taken my work, my effort, my generosity, and worn it like their own accomplishment. I closed my eyes and whispered into the quiet, "Never again." The words tasted strange, final like an oath. Something inside me shifted with them, small but irreversible. This was the last time I would beg for space in a family that built its house on the back of my silence. If they wanted to live without me, I would finally let them. They just hadn't realized yet what living without me really meant. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't even feel like screaming. I just sat at the kitchen table with a cup of cold tea and my laptop open, the blue light casting shadows across the walls. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet, the kind of silence that usually made me restless. But not that night. That night, it felt like power. The trip folder sat on my desktop, a carefully labeled archive: flights, hotels, tours, transfers. I'd spent months building that itinerary with the same precision I brought to every project at work. Every click of my mouse had been driven by love that, as it turned out, was never returned in equal measure. My fingers hovered over the trackpad as my mind went blank for a moment, then sharpened into something focused, deliberate. I opened the airline portal first. It took 3 keystrokes to bring up the reservations. Passenger name, Elaine Monroe. Richard Monroe. Lucas Monroe. I stared at the screen for a long second, then clicked Cancel Booking. The confirmation popped up instantly. Refund initiated. A small, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corner of my lips. Next came the hotels. One by one, I canceled them: Paris, Venice, Prague, watching the confirmation emails fill my inbox like dominoes falling in perfect sequence. The private tour of the Louvre, the gondola dinner cruise, the guided walk across Charles Bridge. Canceled, refunds processed. By the time I closed the laptop, I'd reclaimed every cent. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. It wasn't rage, it was clarity. For the first time in years, I wasn't fixing their mistakes or cleaning up someone else's mess. I was simply removing myself from a system that had fed on my generosity. They wanted to take Lucas instead. Fine. They could have him. They just wouldn't have me or my money. The thought didn't feel cruel. It felt balanced, almost mathematical. For every action, there is an equal reaction. This was mine. I imagined them landing in Paris, smiling for selfies, walking up to the front desk only to find the reservation gone. I pictured my mother's polite charm melting into panic, my father fumbling with his credit card, Lucas blaming everyone but himself. And for once, I didn't feel guilty. I felt free. The digital clock on my microwave blinked, 12:47 a.m. I got up, poured the untouched tea down the sink, and let the quiet settle back over the room. My phone still face down on the counter buzzed once a text from Grace, no doubt wondering how the flight went. I didn't answer. Instead, I went to the living room and opened the suitcase I'd packed so carefully that morning. The clothes, the guidebook, the camera, all symbols of a trip that no longer belonged to me. One by one, I unpacked them. I folded the clothes neatly, returned them to drawers, placed the camera on the shelf. The rhythm of it was oddly soothing, like erasing evidence of a dream that had turned into a nightmare. When I zipped the empty suitcase shut, I felt lighter, almost weightless. I took one last look around my living room, the travel books, the world map pinned with places I'd planned to visit, the candle still flickering on the coffee table, and realized something important. This wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning of something I hadn't known how to start until now. My parents and brother were somewhere high above the Atlantic, blissfully unaware that their luxury vacation had just evaporated mid-air. Meanwhile, I sat in the calm of my own, making the hum of the refrigerator and the faint tick of the clock the only sounds in the room. I whispered into the stillness, "Let them learn." Then I turned off the light, walked upstairs, and for the first time in years, slept without the weight of being needed. The following morning, sunlight streamed through the blinds, soft and gold, the kind that usually made weekends feel gentle. But that day, it hit different. I woke up with a clear head, no guilt gnawing at me, no reflex urge to check my phone or fix something for someone else. It was almost unsettling, that much peace. I brewed coffee, took it to the porch, and watched the quiet street. Somewhere across the ocean, my parents and Lucas were probably touching down in Paris, walking through the arrival gates with smiles that would fade soon enough. I didn't need to imagine it in detail to know how it would play out. I'd spent years troubleshooting other people's problems. I could predict this one like a script. I took another sip and finally opened my phone. The first voicemail came from my mother, her voice tight with confusion. "Violet, there seems to be a mistake. The hotel says the reservation was canceled. Call me, please." The next one, "Angrier Violet, what did you do? They can't find our bookings for the tours either. Fix this now." I scrolled through the messages, watching them escalate from concern to panic to accusation. My father's tone was disappointed, almost rehearsed. "Vi, this isn't like you. Your mother's upset. We're stranded here. Please call us." And then, of course, came Lucas. "You think this is funny? You've embarrassed Mom and Dad. They're standing here like idiots because you couldn't let me come. You're pathetic." I played that one twice, letting the arrogance roll off his tongue like oil. Then I deleted it. One by one, I listened to each voicemail until my inbox was empty. I didn't call them back. I didn't need to. Justice, I realized, didn't have to be loud or dramatic. Sometimes it was just the quiet satisfaction of watching cause meet effect. I opened my laptop and checked the refund confirmations again. Not because I doubted it, but because seeing those emails lined up neatly in my inbox felt like a record of balance being restored. Each subject line was a verdict: refund processed, reservation canceled, booking voided. I took a screenshot and saved it in a folder labeled Proof. It wasn't about revenge. It was about boundaries, about finally showing them that actions have consequences. For years, I'd believed family meant unconditional loyalty, that forgiveness was a duty, that silence kept peace. But peace built on silence is just surrender wearing a polite face. I'd been surrendering my entire adult life. Not anymore. Around noon, my phone buzzed again. Another call from Paris. I let it ring out, then a text appeared. "Violet, this isn't funny. We can't afford the same hotels you booked. We're stuck in some awful place near the airport. Lucas says you're being childish. Please fix this before it gets worse." I stared at the message for a long time, then set the phone down and smiled faintly. They wanted me to fix it. Of course they did. That was my lifelong role, the family fixer. They didn't even know who they were without me cleaning up their messes. The truth was almost poetic. The people who had always taken me for granted were now learning what my absence felt like. I spent the rest of the afternoon cleaning my house, a quiet rhythm of normalcy that felt like reclaiming space. I threw away old receipts, sorted my mail, opened the windows to let in fresh air. The silence wasn't heavy anymore, it was restorative. When the phone buzzed again that evening, I finally answered, mostly out of curiosity. My mother's voice hit like a wave of accusation. "Violet, The hotel says the entire trip was canceled. What on earth were you thinking? I waited a beat, letting the quiet stretch. I canceled them, I said simply. The silence on the other end was instant sharp. You canceled them? Yes. I planned the trip, I paid for it, and you decided to take Lucas instead. Why would I fund something I wasn't part of? That's not how family works, she snapped. We don't punish each other. I laughed softly. Then maybe you should have thought of that before you replaced me. And before she could speak again, I ended the call. I turned off my phone and sat there, the house filled with the kind of silence that hums with victory. Justice didn't always look like revenge. It sometimes looked like peace, freshly brewed and perfectly quiet. By the next morning, the messages came faster, shorter, angrier, more desperate. The first was from my mother, her voice trembling between fury and embarrassment. Violet, this has gone too far. Your father and I had to switch hotels twice last night. Do you have any idea how humiliating this is? Then another. You've made your brother miserable. He's been trying to call you all day. Is this really how you want to treat your family? The word family hit like a match striking old fuel. Family, her favorite weapon. Family was what they always hid behind whenever they wanted me to surrender. I let the phone buzz itself to silence again. Around noon, a string of texts came from Lucas. You're insane. Grow up. You've embarrassed us in front of everyone. Mom cried because of you. I read them once and deleted them. My laptop sat open on the counter, the glow of the screen reflecting off the coffee mug beside it. For once, I didn't feel the slightest urge to explain myself. They could spin whatever version of the story they wanted. I knew the truth, and the truth was simple. I had given everything, and they had taken everything. The imbalance was finally corrected. The irony, though, was delicious. My mother had always been so concerned with appearances, her perfect family, her golden son, her well-behaved daughter. Now stranded in a budget hotel, she'd have to look the concierge in the eye and admit that the fancy trips she'd bragged about had fallen apart. Consequences I thought were rarely elegant, but they were always fair. That evening, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat by the window watching the sun dip behind the houses across the street. The quiet hum of cicadas filled the air. It was strange, but I felt no guilt. For the first time in my life, my mother's disappointment didn't crush me. Her anger no longer defined me. It was as though the emotional leash that had tied me to her approval had finally snapped. My phone buzzed again, and this time, curiosity won. I answered. Violet. My father began, his tone soft but heavy. Your mother's very upset. You shouldn't have done this. Shouldn't have done what I asked, voice steady. Shouldn't have canceled a trip I paid for after being uninvited. He hesitated, the sound of traffic humming faintly behind him. It just feels extreme. Extreme. I repeated, tasting the word like something foreign. You mean like being replaced without warning? He sighed. You've always been the reasonable one. You could have handled this differently. I almost laughed. That's the problem, Dad. I've always been the reasonable one. I've spent my entire life fixing things that weren't mine to fix. We just wanted to help your brother, he said quietly. He's struggling. And I wasn't. I snapped, my composure cracking for the first time. You never once asked how I was doing. You just assumed I'd always be fine. That I'd always pick up the pieces. Well, not this time. There was a long pause. I could hear my mother in the background, her voice sharp, demanding to know what I was saying. I have to go, he muttered finally. Of course, I said, and hung up. The silence afterward felt like a wall closing, but not in a bad way. For once, I was on the right side of it. Later that night, Grace called. You okay? She asked gently. They're losing their minds. I laughed, a small, tired sound. I'm fine. Better than fine. You don't sound guilty, she teased. That's the best part, I said. I'm not. She exhaled in relief. Good. It's about time, Vi. You've been their safety net long enough. Let them fall for once. When the call ended, I walked outside to the porch and looked up at the stars. The night was quiet, peaceful, alive with summer warmth. I thought about my family across the ocean, about the panic, the phone calls, the guilt they were trying to throw my way. For years, I'd carried their chaos like a second skin. Now I'd peeled it off piece by piece until there was nothing left but my own peace. It wasn't vengeance, it was equilibrium, and it felt perfect. The next few days felt eerily calm, like the world had exhaled and finally left me alone. My phone sat on the counter dark and still no longer vibrating with demands or guilt. The first morning of true silence, I woke up early out of habit, waiting for the familiar rush of anxiety that usually came with my parents' calls or Lucas's messages asking for help. It never came. Instead, I made coffee, sat on my porch, and watched the world stretch awake joggers passing sprinklers, hissing sunlight cutting through the trees. For the first time in years, the day belonged entirely to me. I opened my laptop not to check emails, but to look at my bank balance. The refunds from the canceled trip had all gone through. The number looked solid, satisfying. I closed the browser, made a quiet promise to myself that money would never again be spent trying to earn love. I spent the rest of the morning cleaning, but it didn't feel like a chore. It felt like a purge. Every drawer I straightened, every old receipt I threw away was a piece of history I didn't need anymore. The house felt lighter, like it was finally reflecting the peace inside me. Around noon, the phone buzzed again. I almost ignored it until I saw the name Grace. I answered, half smiling already. "You sound too calm," she said without preamble. "Did you kill them?" I laughed, really laughed for the first time all week. "No bodies, I promise. Just a canceled vacation." She whistled softly. "That's worse. My God, Vi, you really did it. They replaced me like it was nothing." I said quietly, "I just removed the reward. And how does it feel?" "Peaceful," I said after a pause. "Scary, peaceful, like I should feel bad, but I don't." "That's not guilt, babe," Grace replied. "That's detox." I smiled into the phone, nodding, even though she couldn't see me. "I think you're right." After we hung up, I made lunch, watched an old movie, and even took a nap in the middle of the afternoon, something I hadn't done in years without guilt gnawing at me. It was almost unsettling to realize how much space I'd given up to other people's expectations. The quiet had weight now, but it was the kind that grounded me, not the kind that suffocated. By evening, I found myself journaling again, something I hadn't done since college. The pen moved easily across the page as I wrote everything I couldn't say to them. "You taught me to keep the peace at any cost, but it was always my peace that got spent. You taught me family meant sacrifice, but somehow, I was the only one bleeding." I closed the notebook feeling strangely lighter. Maybe this was what it meant to start over, not with grand gestures, but with small acts of self-respect. The silence didn't mean loneliness. It meant boundaries. That night, I sat on the porch again, the cicadas humming softly under the stars. For once, I didn't feel the urge to check my phone or explain myself to anyone. The house, the air, the stillness, it all belonged to me. I thought about my parents and Lucas in Europe, imagining them in some cheap hotel room arguing over who was to blame. My mother would be furious, my father embarrassed, Lucas indignant. And underneath it all, maybe, just maybe, a flicker of realization would start to form that I wasn't their endless resource anymore. I wasn't their fix-it girl. I was just gone. I took a deep breath and smiled faintly. Freedom didn't look like fireworks or applause. It looked like a quiet evening, a cup of coffee gone cold, and the deep, satisfying knowledge that I owed no one an apology. For years, I'd been the silence that followed their chaos. Now that silence was finally mine to keep. When their taxi finally pulled into my parents' driveway a week later, I was already there sitting on the porch swing with a mug of coffee in hand. The morning was hot, the air heavy with the scent of cut grass and jet fuel from the nearby airport. I'd known they'd be back that day, not because they'd told me, but because my mother couldn't go more than a few hours without trying to reclaim control. The taxi door opened, and there they were. My parents, sunburned, tired, dragging their suitcases with a kind of indignation that looked heavier than jet lag. Lucas trailed behind them, sunglasses on, phone in hand, muttering curses under his breath. "Well," my mother said the moment she spotted me, her voice clipped, "I hope you're happy." I took a slow sip of coffee, unbothered. "Happy about what? Our trip was a disaster," she snapped, waving her hand as if swatting away smoke. "We had to stay in awful motels. The food was terrible. Every tour we tried to book was full. We spent half the week trying to fix the mess you made. You mean the trip I planned and paid for? I asked evenly. The one you decided I didn't need to be part of. She blinked, thrown off by my calm tone. You didn't have to ruin it for us, Violet. You went too far. Lucas dropped his bag with a thud and folded his arms. You really screwed us over. You could have just let it go, but no, you had to make a point. I turned to him, my voice steady. I didn't make a point, Lucas. I made a decision. There's a difference. He scoffed. You've always been so dramatic. You act like you're better than everyone. No, I said quietly. I just finally stopped pretending I'm less. My father stepped forward, his tone soft but condescending. Vi, you didn't have to do this. We could have talked about it. You mean like adults? I raised an eyebrow. Because when I tried to talk to you that morning, you all walked right past me. We thought you'd understand, my mother interjected sharply. Lucas has been struggling. He needed a break. I let out a small, humorless laugh. Struggling? He hasn't worked in over a year, Mom. He needed accountability, not a vacation. You've always been so hard on him, she said, her voice rising. He's your brother, and I've been his second wallet, I said. His cheerleader, his safety net, his scapegoat, but never his equal. Do you even hear yourselves? They all stared at me as if I were speaking another language. Lucas rolled his eyes and muttered, Here we go again. That was the moment the last thread of patience inside me snapped, but not in anger. It snapped in finality. I stood, setting my coffee cup down carefully on the table beside me. Do you know what's funny? I said, looking directly at my mother. You've spent years calling me the responsible one, the strong one, the stable one. But the moment I use that strength to say no, suddenly I'm cruel. Suddenly I'm selfish. You humiliated us, she hissed. You humiliated yourselves, I replied calmly. I just stopped paying for the illusion. My father's face softened slightly, guilt flickering behind his eyes. Violet, we didn't mean to hurt you. You didn't mean to think of me either, I said. The words hung in the air like smoke impossible to swallow. For a long moment no one spoke. Even Lucas shifted uncomfortably, his usual bravado cracking. I grabbed my bag from the porch swing and slung it over my shoulder. I'm glad you're back safely, I said, my tone even. But don't expect things to go back to the way they were. I'm done playing the fixer. You made your choice. Now you can live with it. I turned and walked toward my car, my heels clicking against the driveway. Behind me, my mother called out, her voice shrill with a mix of anger and disbelief. You can't just walk away from your family. I opened the car door, looked back once, and met her eyes. I already did, I said, and closed the door. As I drove away, their figures grew smaller in the rearview mirror, 3 people who had once defined my world, now just silhouettes fading in the distance. The weight that had lived in my chest for years lifted with every mile, replaced by something far stronger than anger, peace, wrapped in clarity. I didn't drive home right away. Instead, I pulled into a quiet park on the edge of town, a place I used to go after work when I needed to breathe. I parked under a row of oaks and sat there for a long time, engine off hands, resting loosely on the steering wheel. My heart wasn't racing anymore. It beat steady and calm, like it had finally remembered what normal felt like. The confrontation had drained me, but not in the way arguments used to. There was no ache to be understood, no desperate need for them to apologize. The truth was, I didn't care whether they saw it my way or not. For the first time, I wasn't seeking their approval, I was simply done. It struck me how foreign that feeling was. For 37 years, I had been defined by service, by how much I gave, how quietly I endured, how smoothly I made life run for everyone else. My mother had once told me that being strong meant not making problems. My father had taught me that keeping the peace was the same as love. Lucas had learned that someone else would always clean up his chaos. But sitting there beneath the shade of the oaks, I realized I'd learned something too, that silence can be a form of courage when it's chosen, not imposed. I rolled down the window, letting the breeze wash over me. It carried the faint hum of cicadas, the smell of cut grass, the laughter of children somewhere nearby. The world went on indifferent, simple whole, and I felt small but steady within it. It was almost poetic how still everything was, as if the universe was giving me permission to stop holding my breath. I pulled out my notebook, the one I used for work, but had lately filled with fragments of thought. I flipped to a blank page and wrote, "Peace doesn't mean avoiding conflict. It means refusing to carry other people's chaos." The words looked clean strong, like they belonged to someone new. Maybe they did. I thought of the years I'd lost chasing my family's approval, trying to prove I was worthy of the affection they gave so freely to my brother. I remembered how many times I'd stayed quiet to keep them comfortable, how many times I'd absorbed their guilt just to keep the family intact. The pattern was so deep it felt generational, like a story written before I was born. My grandmother had been the same gentle, selfless, worn down to the bone by other people's needs. My mother had inherited that and twisted it into control. And me, I'd been the perfect student of it until the lesson finally broke me. But breaking wasn't always a bad thing. Sometimes it was how light got in. My phone buzzed once on the passenger seat. A text from Grace. "Thinking of you. Proud of you." I smiled, that quiet kind of smile that doesn't need witnesses. Grace had been my anchor through the storm, the voice that reminded me that setting boundaries wasn't cruelty. It was self-respect. I typed back, "It's strange. I thought I'd feel empty, but I don't. Just clear." She replied almost instantly, "That's what freedom sounds like." I laughed softly and closed my eyes. She was right. Freedom didn't roar. It whispered. It was the absence of constant noise, of apologizing for existing, of making yourself small so others could feel big. It was this, the simple act of breathing without obligation. I stayed there until the sun began to lower, the light filtering through the leaves in long, amber stripes. I wasn't sure what came next, but for the first time, that uncertainty didn't scare me. It thrilled me. I had always lived for other people's plans. Maybe it was time I finally made my own. I started the car, the soft hum of the engine grounding me in the moment. As I pulled out of the park, I whispered to myself, "This isn't the end. It's the first chapter I get to write for me." And with that, I drove toward the quiet horizon, no longer running from anything, just moving forward. A week later, I found myself at O'Hare Airport again, but this time the suitcase by my side wasn't packed for anyone else. It was mine. Inside were clothes I actually liked, my camera, a journal, and a guidebook to Italy. I had booked the flight 3 nights earlier, sitting at my kitchen counter with a glass of wine and a steady pulse of excitement I hadn't felt in years. I didn't tell anyone, no long explanations, no group chat updates. This trip wasn't about proving anything. It was about breathing. When the plane lifted through the clouds, I looked out the window and watched Chicago shrink beneath the wings. It was strange realizing that I'd spent most of my life waiting for permission to do things I could have done all along. By the time we landed in Florence, the air smelled of espresso and warm bread. The taxi ride from the airport wound through narrow streets lined with honey-colored buildings and flowered balconies. The driver spoke little English, but when he said, "First time," and I nodded, he smiled. "You picked a good time to start living," he said. Maybe he didn't mean it that way, but the words stuck. My room overlooked the Arno River, the windows framed by ivy and morning light. I dropped my bags, opened the shutters, and stood there for a moment, no one to answer to, no one waiting on the other side of a phone call. Just me, the sound of church bells in the distance, and a quiet sense of arrival. The next few days unfolded like a life I didn't know I'd been missing. I wandered the cobblestone alleys with my camera, tasted pasta so rich it felt like a sin, and spent hours sketching in Piazza della Repubblica, letting the street music and chatter blur into background warmth. There was no itinerary, no schedule, no guilt. I woke when I wanted. I rested when I needed. Each day I became a little less someone's daughter and a little more myself. One afternoon, while sipping cappuccino at a small cafe by the Ponte Vecchio, I opened my journal. The first page held the same sentence I'd written in the park. "Peace doesn't mean avoiding conflict. It means refusing to carry other people's chaos." Below it, I added a new line. "Freedom isn't loud, it's steady." I smiled, closing the book. Maybe this was what my mother never understood. To her, love was control. To me, love, real love, was space, giving and receiving it freely without debt. I took a picture of the Arno glinting under the afternoon sun and sent it to Grace. Within seconds, she replied, "You look happy." Like really happy. I typed back, "I think I am." On my fifth night, I had dinner at a small family-owned restaurant overlooking the river. The owner, an older woman with silver hair and kind eyes, brought me wine and asked if I was traveling alone. When I nodded, she said, "Brava." Some people never learn how to enjoy their own company. That night, I wrote another page in my journal. I used to plan trips to make other people happy. This one is the first thing I've ever done just for me. It felt like a confession, but also like absolution. On my last day in Florence, I walked across the Ponte Santa Trinita as the sky blazed pink and gold. The water shimmered below the city, glowing like an old painting. I thought about my parents, about how far away they felt now, not just in miles, but in meaning. I didn't hate them. I just didn't need them to define me anymore. The person who had planned a perfect family vacation was gone. The woman standing there, camera in hand, was someone new, someone who no longer begged to be seen. As night settled over the city, I whispered into the breeze, "I see me now." It wasn't loud, but it was enough. When I returned to Chicago 2 weeks later, the house felt different. Still mine, but quieter in a way that wasn't lonely, just honest. I unpacked slowly, placing the Italian souvenirs on the shelves where old family photos used to stand. A hand-painted mug from Florence replaced the crystal frame that had once held a picture of Lucas and me as kids. It felt symbolic, like rewriting my own history one object at a time. 3 days after I got back, my phone rang. It was my mother. I hesitated, staring at her name flashing on the screen, then answered. Her voice was careful, the kind she used when she wanted to sound gentle, but still be in control. "Hi, sweetheart. How was your trip?" "Wonderful," I said, keeping my tone light. "How was yours?" There was a pause, a long one. It was not what we expected. I could almost picture her standing in the kitchen, twisting the phone cord around her fingers the way she used to when she was nervous. "Your father and I have been thinking a lot about what happened. Maybe we didn't handle things well." "Maybe," I echoed softly. "You replaced me on a trip I paid for and acted like I should thank you for the honor." She sighed, a sound filled with the weight of someone realizing too late that the apology window was closing. "We didn't mean to hurt you, Violet. We just wanted to help your brother." "And how did that work out?" I asked. "Did Europe fix him?" She went quiet for a moment, and I knew the answer before she spoke. "He's still finding his way." "Of course he is," I murmured. "Because why would he change when everyone keeps rewarding him for standing still?" "You don't have to be so cruel." She snapped, her composure cracking. I didn't raise my voice. "I'm not being cruel, Mom. I'm being honest. There's a difference." Another long pause. When she finally spoke again, her voice trembled with something I hadn't heard before, fatigue. "Your father and I, we missed you. It wasn't the same without you." I know, I said, calm and steady. That's what happens when the person who holds everything together stops showing up. She tried to laugh, but it came out hollow. "You make it sound like we can't manage without you." "I think you already proved that," I replied. The silence that followed was deep and raw. I almost felt sorry for her, but only almost. "Violet," she said finally, her voice softening, "we're not perfect. We made mistakes. I just don't want this distance to last forever." Then maybe I said, "Stop pretending it's my job to fix everything. I'm not your buffer. I'm not your balance. I'm your daughter. And if you want me in your life, start treating me like one." For once, she didn't argue. "I'll try." She said the words so fragile I almost believed them. "I hope so," I said. "Because trying is the only thing that'll make a difference now." After we hung up, I sat there for a long time, my phone still in my hand. I felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, exhaustion, and something almost like pity. They weren't villains. They were just people too comfortable in a system that had always benefited them, and I had been the one who finally refused to keep that system running. 2 days later, an email arrived. It was from my father. Short, formal, but sincere. "Violet, your mother told me you spoke." I wanted to say I'm sorry too. You've done more for this family than anyone should have to. I'm proud of you, even if I didn't say it before. I hope you'll forgive us someday. I read it twice, then closed my laptop. Forgiveness. I realized wasn't a gift I owed them. It was a choice I could make when I was ready. And maybe one day I would. But not yet. For now, the balance had been restored. I walked to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of wine, and raised it quietly to the empty room. Justice wasn't loud or dramatic. It was this a life finally lived on my own terms. And somewhere deep down, I hoped my mother felt that silence too, the silence that used to mean submission, now transformed into consequence. Months passed, and autumn rolled through Chicago like a slow exhale. The air turned crisp, the city lights sharper against the early dusk. I'd fallen into a rhythm that finally felt like mine work walks along the river after sunset dinners cooked just for one without apology. My house had never been quieter, and yet it had never felt more alive. There were no late-night guilt calls, no last-minute pleas for help, no constant hum of being needed. Just peace, the kind that doesn't come from fixing things, but from letting them break. One evening I came home to find an envelope in my mailbox. My mother's handwriting, elegant, deliberate. I took it inside, poured a cup of tea, and opened it slowly. The letter inside was several pages long. "Dear Violet," it began. "I know words may not be enough, but I hope they can be a start. I've spent my whole life trying to keep our family together, but somewhere along the way I forgot that holding things too tightly can break them. You were always our steady one, our anchor. I took that for granted. I'm sorry for what we did, for taking Lucas instead, for assuming you'd always understand. Your father says you've found peace. I hope that's true. I hope someday you'll let us be part of it again." I set the letter down and stared at it for a long time. The old me would have cried, written back immediately, maybe even driven over to comfort her. The woman I was now simply breathed. It wasn't anger I felt. It was distance, the kind that comes not from bitterness but from clarity. They were finally learning what boundaries felt like, and I was finally learning that forgiveness didn't have to mean returning. Sometimes peace was simply staying gone. That weekend, Grace came by with coffee and a grin. "You look different," she said, leaning against the counter. "Lighter," I laughed softly. "Maybe I am." "You heard from them?" she asked, already knowing the answer. "A letter," I said. "The kind that sounds sorry but still hopes I'll come running back." Grace tilted her head. "Are you going to?" I smiled, shaking my head. "No, I've already been back before I ever left. This time, I'm staying gone." She nodded approvingly. "So, what's next?" That question hung in the air for a moment. I looked around my living room, the framed photo from Florence on the wall, the journal on the coffee table filled with half-finished plans, the soft hum of the city outside. "I don't know yet," I said finally. "But for once, I get to decide." Later that night, I sat on the porch with a blanket around my shoulders, the autumn wind threading through the trees. I thought about everything that had happened, the betrayal, the silence, the confrontation, the quiet justice that followed. It hadn't been revenge that saved me. It was restraint. The choice to stop explaining, to stop negotiating my worth, to simply let the consequences speak louder than any argument could. I took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill my lungs, and smiled. In my mind, I could almost hear my mother's voice again, softer this time, saying she hoped I'd find peace. I already had, just not in the way she imagined. Peace wasn't the absence of pain, it was the presence of self. Inside, my phone buzzed with a new message. From Grace. "Next trip idea, Portugal solo again, or maybe with a friend this time," I typed back. "Let's see where the wind takes us." Then I set the phone aside and closed my eyes. For so long, I'd believed silence was a punishment, a sign of distance, of loss. But now I understood it was something else entirely. Silence, when chosen, was power. It was grace. It was the sound of finally coming home to yourself. The leaves rustled softly around me, whispering through the night air, and I let the quiet settle like a promise. This wasn't just the end of a chapter. It was the start of a life built on boundaries, respect, and quiet freedom. And to anyone out there who's ever been the forgotten one, the fixer, the afterthought, remember this: you don't owe anyone your peace to prove your love. Sometimes the loudest justice is the one that doesn't make a sound.